Welcome to Daily Drive for Wednesday, June 10th, 2026. I'm Kellen Walker in Las Vegas. Today on the show, there's a light at the end of the tunnel for Ford's aluminum supply problem. A top supplier CEO warns that the war in Iran could bring car assembly lines to a halt by the second half of this year. And GM is making a play for the energy storage market, with AI data centers driving the opportunity. Plus, Magna International CEO Swami Kotagiri joins the show to talk about navigating tariffs, stranded EV capacity, and Chinese brands knocking on the door.
Not locking in on one outcome and over-indexing is the big lesson you learn from this whole process.
Let's run through all the news you need to know to keep up in the auto industry. Good news for Ford. Aluminum supplier Novelis has restarted its plant in Oswego, New York. That's the facility that makes the aluminum sheet that goes into the F-Series truck bodies. Two fires knocked it offline last fall, and the ripple effects have been brutal. Ford took up to a $2 billion charge. F-Series sales are down 15% year to date, and lot inventory is still 16% below where it was a year ago. Ford says supplies won't be back to normal until later this year. Think about everything that goes into building a car. The coatings, the plastics, the battery materials, the catalysts. A lot of that comes from one company, BASF, and its CEO is worried. Marcus Kamit told journalists in Frankfurt that the U.S.-Israeli conflict with Iran is already causing shortages of basic inputs like sulfur and helium. He warns that tightly run production lines like car assembly could grind to a halt in the second half of this year. And General Motors is pivoting its battery business toward the electrical grid, developing sodium-ion batteries with California-based Peak Energy for industrial-scale energy storage. GM says electricity demand from AI data centers could triple by 2028, straining grids and creating a new market for battery technology. Magna International operates in 27 countries, generates roughly $5.5 billion in revenue from China alone, and makes components that go into vehicles regardless of what's under the hood. So when its CEO talks about the state of the industry, it's worth listening. Swami Kotagiri sat down with Kurt Nagel of our sibling publication, Crane's Detroit Business, to talk about what's really driving hesitation in capital deployment right now, what Magna learned from the EV volume shortfall, how the company is navigating its relationships with Chinese OEMs, and how it's preparing for whatever comes out of the USMCA renegotiation.
I'm here with Swami Kotagiri, CEO of Magna International. Swami, thanks for being here.
Good morning, Kurt. Thanks for having me.
So, sourcing rules, inflation, tariffs, incentives, all of these various factors that are complicating manufacturing footprint decisions. If you had to point to one that's the most challenging to account for, what would you say?
Uncertainty.
That kind of encompasses everything.
Absolutely, right? Because the reason why we are having this conversation and you bring it up is the disruption that each of this thing has created. And the disruption is nothing that is lasting, but it's having an impact on how you think about it today. And it causes hesitation in deploying capital. So you take away uncertainty, that means you solve the problems and there is nothing bubbling.
So you talked a bit about making the manufacturing process more efficient and making the design process such that you simplify products. Would you say that's the focus of a supplier now is not necessarily making the next cutting edge product, but making the cutting edge way to make the product?
Unfortunately, Kurt, this is not anything new, right? Even when I was in school, which is a long time ago, we learned something called simultaneous engineering. So when you design a product, you should be aware of where it's going to be made, what equipment is going to be used to make it, so that you can design for manufacturability, right? And the engineering lingo, that is learning the failure modes, what can go wrong, put the right controls in place, and so on and so forth. So this is really manufacturing and design working together. It's always been there, should be there for any good practice. But it's become more relevant now because of the rate at which the design of the car and the use of the car and the way the cars are manufactured is all changing at the same time, because technology is changing, consumer habits are changing, there is, propulsion systems are coming in, and so on and so forth. So it's just become a little bit more relevant, but I think it was always an important thing.
So let's talk about something that, from my perspective, seems to have changed a little bit, and that's the relationship between supplier and automaker.
Yep.
Especially in light of the EV volumes coming up short of expectations. Could you talk a bit about how that now informs your decision with customers when you're quoting programs and such?
Yeah. I think, look, the EVs, the example that you gave, electrification was just a reaction to the market signals, whether it's consumer demand, policy, whatever, or technology. If you sit back and look at it, we always need to have that conversation, which brings a little bit of pragmatism to the table. So in other words, if the OEM and the supplier sit together as partners and say, this is what we are trying to make, this is what we're going to invest together, and here is the possible implications if you don't hit the volumes, right? So can we phase it in, or is the premium worth the market you're trying to capture, right? So those are the discussions that we've had in the past, but now we have data to show that, hey, if we had taken this path, we could have mitigated the impact, right? Not locking in on one outcome and over-indexing is the big lesson you learn from this whole process, right? I still believe electrification is a secular trend, but it's just not moving at the trajectory that everybody thought it would.
So unlike, automakers don't promise volumes. I don't think that that's changed, or maybe it has, but what sort of, I guess, protections can you put in place from a supplier perspective that maybe in the past automakers wouldn't have, agreed to?
Yeah, maybe not as much protections, but call it a pain share to bring a little bit more pragmatism into the thinking, right? I've talked about in the last couple of years, when inflation came in and EV surge was happening and it withdrew or recalibrated itself, we started talking about a few things. One, the labor economics are going to be reset when the program is starting versus when you won the job, right? And the gap is 2 years sometimes. You win the job 2 years after you launch it. So that's one example. The other one, we always have a viewpoint on what we think the volume is going to be, right? Either based on historical data or just, what we believe. And that's a mutual discussion to have. In some cases, we have asked the OEM to participate in the capital deployment, not just the supplier putting in the capital. So there have been some instances where we have had that. The third one we call not volume protection, but banding. There is a band of, we think we're going to produce 100. If it's 80, it's 120, we'll find a way to go along with it. But if the change is higher than that, then we'll have a discussion commercially, right? So some of these things have helped constrain the problem a little bit better, and that's a lesson learned.
Got to talk about China.
Yep.
Obviously, that's if not the focal point, one of the central topics in supplier conversations is growing your Chinese domestic business in China, obviously, now in Europe, and now Canada.
Yeah.
In what ways is Magna sizing up the opportunity generally, and are you in talks with Chinese domestic OEs trying to enter and grow in Canada?
So, like I said, I think about $5.5 billion of our total revenue is in China, coming from China. And we have typically always focused on localizing production where there is demand and meeting the policy requirements. And 65% of that total China business is with Chinese OEMs, right? So we are in the Chinese ecosystem supplying them today as supplier partners. And if you go back 20 years when the Europeans who we were producing for in Europe came to North America, we came, with them to start supplying for their assembly plants in North America. what we're going to do with Chinese OEMs is no different, right? There is nothing specific we're doing by country. We are in 27 different countries. So this is going to be no different other than how we worked with OEMs before.
So can you say if you're in talks with Chinese OEMs trying to grow and establish themselves in Canada?
Not specific to Canada, but as I told you, we have business in China with Chinese OEMs. So we are part of their ecosystem and we'll have discussions on many programs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not specific to a country.
And I got to ask one more question on that, just because obviously it's a competitive issue with your major customers here in Detroit. How sensitive is that relationship that Magna's forging with these new Chinese domestic entrants, and how do you balance that with your legacy business, these competitive Detroit automakers?
Honestly, we work with all customers globally today, right? And this is no different because they are all mutual competitors to each other. We have everything in place and we highly respect the confidentiality that comes along with producing parts. We've been in business for almost 70 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something we take very seriously. So I don't think this is any different. They know we've been working with different OEMs all across the world. This is no different.
On the topic of automation, artificial intelligence and such, is that more driven like in-house by the supplier to try to be more competitive in bidding these products? Or do you feel pressure from automakers and customers saying, hey, Magna, you need to implement this piece of automation or what have you?
No, I think it's most customers care for is quality in-time delivery and being competitive, right? To me, a lot of these tools are enablers of continuous improvement in productivity, which ultimately results in, being competitive and therefore better for the consumers in terms of affordability. So it's more internally driven to keep the advantage that we have and get that little bit of edge.
On the topic of EVs again, Magna is no different than other suppliers and some stranded capacity, these big EV investments, and now suppliers trying to fill out these plants that are not producing parts in the way that was previously predicted. Can you tell me what the conversation is like with General Motors or Ford, where you made these big investments, so you're not getting the payback that you planned? How are you being made whole?
Yeah, I don't think anybody's being made whole. Now you have to define what being made whole is, right? So in some cases, it is redeployment on different programs. Sometimes it is the customers compensating in terms of the capital that was put in place for a specific program, but it's still an opportunity lost, right? You don't want to be getting back your capital. What you really want is the capital working to get the revenue and therefore the profits. But the market conditions changed. It was dynamic. So it was a mutual way to find the best way to solve the problem that we have at hand. I would say that the discussions have been fair given the difficult situation we were all in. They're never easy, but it's not as simple as here's my bill, they pay. It goes into what other programs can we work on? Where can I redeploy? How should we look at this in the long term? So a combination of these things is how we're addressing the problem.
And to drill down into that just a little bit, so like the investments announced here in Michigan, there was, I think, like $500 million or so in 2022 was announced for these EV programs. Could you provide maybe just a high level sort of status check on, where these projects stand and how you're using that capital in that capacity?
Yeah, you must be talking of the MEVS plant in St. Clair Shores. Again, all of these things have been in place. Some of it was compensation by the OEMs on capital that was put in place, but programs were canceled. Some of it was reutilizing the equipment for other programs. Some of it is where the customers are coming in to say, here's other programs that we can put in place. And they don't necessarily have to be EV. And that's the advantage of Magna, right? 80% of our business is agnostic to propulsion system. So it doesn't matter whether it's EV or hybrid or, or EV. So there is a lot of conversations with different customers. We have seen programs already awarded that are going to be launched there. So it's a continuing process of, reutilizing the space and resources that were meant to be for one specific program.
What are those programs that are being launched there?
Can't talk about it.
We can break news if you want.
I know. But this is what I was talking about, respecting the confidentiality of the customers.
Understood. And tariffs, because we couldn't let you get away without talking a little bit about the tariffs. I've heard just generally that tariff refunds either haven't hit yet or they're coming very, very slowly. What is Magna's perspective on that?
We are in the process. I think we've gone through the normal process. And you have to recognize that when we were going through the last 1.5 years, we have got compensated for the tariff exposure by the customers, right? So when and if we get this tariff recovery, it's a pass-through to the customer.
Mm-hmm.
So 80 cents to $1, we've been compensated. So all of that goes back. So there might be a little upside to the exposure that we have taken in the last year. I talked about 10 basis points for Magna roughly being the headwind or the impact last year. Similar this year. If these things come, it'll offset a small piece of that.
Have they come yet? Do you know? Or I don't know how far you are in the weeds of that, but has the government actually issued the refund checks? Or?
Honestly, I don't know the details of it, but it's in process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then just last question for you on the USMCA and the trade negotiations and such. Can Magna do anything, or has it done anything proactively in preparation for what may come of these negotiations, or is it really just a wait and see and figure out where all the pieces fall?
As we went through the tariff discussions, we've been working with customers to, first of all, under the existing framework, what can we do to make it USMCA compliant? What alternatives do you have in the supply chain to mitigate tariff exposure? We have always talked about localizing production to meet, demand and policy requirements. So we have the footprint. It'll depend on how the OEMs are thinking about their long-term strategy, because we supply to the OEM assembly plants, taking into account the logistics and, the size of the part, ease of transportation. So we'll have to wait and see, right? But do we have scenario planning? Again, based on discussions with customers? Of course, yes. We can't be sitting and waiting. So let's see what scenario works out.
That's Daily Drive for today. I'm Kellen Walker. Thanks to Automotive News executive producer Jake Neer, as well as our own John Irwin for his reporting for today's podcast. You can get the latest news on supplier strategy, GM's battery business, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com. Come back tomorrow for a conversation with our own Urvash Kakaria about Honda targeting Toyota with a refreshed Accord and a more rugged Passport.
With current, fuel prices being high, affordability being an issue across the industry, sedans sort of maybe having their renaissance, and Honda wants to be there for it.
We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. And if you enjoy the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.